Okay, here's a species we haven't encountered yet. This is called silverbell, Carolina silverbell. And silverbell is one of my favorite in terms of the bark and the coloration of the bark. And this is because of the, it's got this slatey look to it, this slate gray color, and this kind of the bark kind of squared, but way up in there. Okay, but the flowers bloom in the spring and they're white and bell shaped, which hence why it's called silverbell. And this is a pretty big one. Okay, actually even further down the mountain I see one that's even bigger than this one. Okay, but they can get quite huge. One of the biggest ones I've ever seen is down along the road closer to Chimney Rock. There's one growing behind a house down there, and that sucker is probably close to 2 feet in diameter, so it's a big one. Okay, this one is probably close to 14 inches in diameter. I don't have a diameter tape with me to be able to measure it, but it's a pretty sizable one. And silverbell is one that you really start to see a lot more of as you get into the mountains. So this is more of a mountain species than a Piedmont, and there are a couple subspecies, and the ones that you find down in the mountain or down in the Piedmont is a different subspecies than this one. Okay, because the other one doesn't grow quite as large. It tends to be a little more gangly, and you find a lot of times in riparian areas along rivers and places like that. Okay, another glimpse down the hill. If you look at that tree there, that's a big tulip poplar, and that one is ginormous. Okay, that is what we call an old growth tulip poplar, because it has been here probably a couple hundred years. Okay, that is a really massive tree, and we're getting into what we call the old growth portion of Bat Cave Preserve. Back around the late 1800s, early 1900s was when the valley was cut as far as clear cutting, especially during the early years of the 1900s. And the reason being was this was the time that chestnut blight came in and killed a large number of the chestnut trees. Okay, and so the chestnut trees were dying, and so rather than just let them just stand there and rot, because you've got to remember these things were giant trees, they would go in and they would cut them out. And in doing so, they opened up the forest floor. But they didn't take just chestnut trees, they took oak trees as well. Basically, if it was mature at that time, they took it, okay, and harvested it and used it for wood. So a lot of early buildings, early barns and houses and things were actually built with the chestnut wood that was harvested from those large trees. But there are certain places, especially here within Hickory Nut Gorge, where the terrain was just too steep to be able to get logging equipment into, and this was all done by mule teams and draft horses and things like that, and the horses had to be able to climb the slopes in order to be able to get the logs out. So if they couldn't get there with the horses, then they didn't cut it. And so this happens to be an area that just was not cut. And as we move forward, as this terrain gets steeper, you'll see some more really big trees, but these are all pretty nice ones. Another really big, nice tree, okay? This is black locust. Some people also call it yellow locust. Okay, if you remember, Dave Canterbury mentioned honey locust, and then as an aside, he mentioned black locust. We don't see a lot of honey locust in the mountains. It's more of a Piedmont species or coastal plain, typically where you see that, but we see black locust a lot in the mountains. And when you see one this big, it's really, really old. Okay, because black locust is not a long-lived tree. It's a successional species, so it grows starting out when things are just small. So most likely this thing probably is a little over 100 years old, if I were just to guess. It probably has pretty large growth rings because these are fast-growing trees. But it's one that just was, whenever they were, they probably did a little bit of logging in here, nothing substantial. Okay, but there was probably some in here, and this grew when a light gap occurred in the canopy. May have been a large tree that fell, could have been a chestnut tree that fell in here and opened up a light gap so that this tree could grow here. But black locust is important because this was a huge resource for making fence posts and things like that. Because the great thing about black locust is the wood is very dense, it's hard as can be, it'll split well, okay, hence why they use it for split rail fences, but they last forever. Locust wood just doesn't rot. I mean, it will sit on the ground forever, it seems, unless it's in contact with really moist soil, but it will still take a long time for it to rot. This is also one that burns extremely hot, so it has a high BTU number. Probably one of the hottest burning woods that we have in our forest. Hence why it's not recommended to burn in wood stoves, because it will actually catch the wood stove on fire because it burns so hot. Okay, there's some other. You can start to pick up some more big trees. There's a big silver bell right over there. You can see there's another fairly good sized tulip poplar. I see a white ash tree that's further down there past that silver bell. And here's one that we've not seen yet or talked about. This one directly in front of me here. Okay, this is called basswood. Okay, basswood is also a mountain species. Okay, and basswood is a really cool tree. It's got these heart-shaped leaves. So if you look up, you can see, well, I don't know how well that's working out, but here's one right here beside me. It's a smaller one. Okay, this is basswood. Basswood puts out these weird-looking fruit. Okay, that have a kind of a flattened leaf. I'm looking on the ground, see if I can see any of the fruit from it. Okay, if I were in Chimney Rock, I'd be finding them all over the place probably. But basswood is a wood carver's dream. They actually love to use basswood for carving. The wood is really soft and it works well, and so wood carvers really like basswood, and they use basswood for even use it for making guitars and things like that, other musical instruments. Mountain dulcimers were probably made from basswood just because the wood's so workable. But it's a really nice plant, and what you see a lot of times, particularly on mature ones, you'll see a lot of sucker sprouts that come up around the trunk. Okay, but it's really neat. They've got a heart-shaped leaf, and of course these have about had it. Okay, because we're getting so late in the year and fall's coming. These leaves generally just kind of drop off. They're real thin, and they just dry up and fall off the tree. But notice that interesting striping that the bark has. So that's one way to identify this as basswood. Here's a really cool leaf. Okay, this is the leaf to a bloodroot. And if you closed all those lobes in, you would notice that it would be what we call kidney shaped or reniform. Okay, reniform means kidney. That R-E-N-I, reni, actually means kidney, and form, shape, so kidney shaped. Okay, so it would have been believed, based on that shape, that most likely you could have used bloodroot for kidney ailments, and it may have been used for that, but as far as like traditional medicine is concerned. But bloodroot is not something to be messed with too much. Okay, bloodroot has some toxins in it. Has a chemical in it called sanguinarine that is toxic. Okay, but there are properties of that particular alkaloid that have been used in studies for different types of chemotherapies for cancer. So it makes it really interesting. It's called bloodroot because if you were to dig this up, the root is a kind of a reddish orange color, and so it looks like it's bleeding when you break it because the sap comes out. It's kind of reddish. And this was used as a dye, and for things such as that. It also has some chemicals that have been used in toothpaste. So it's a really interesting plant, and it's native to these kind of forests. So it really likes these rich soils, and you'd find this all over here. And it blooms in the spring. It has these really beautiful white blossoms. So I'm actually surprised that this one's still left. okay, but sometimes the leaves will persist. Most of the growth is occurring under the ground, okay, so it'll have a long root under there, and the leaf is just doing the photosynthesis for it, and then it will spend time growing the rest of the year. So this is what we call a spring ephemeral, and which is another reason why I'm actually surprised that the leaves are still persisting. So I guess it's just really, really happy. Here's another silver bell. It's so wet because it's rained over the last couple of days, but it's kind of hard to actually capture the texture of the bark. That's probably better representative. Here you can see some leaves. Okay, the leaves are again simple, alternate, and entire. They have entire margins, so that means the margin is doesn't have any teeth or lobes or anything like that. Okay, Carolina silverbell. Okay, we've talked about tulip poplar and how it's a member of the magnolia family. Well, this is an actual magnolia. Okay, this is called cucumber tree or cucumber magnolia. Some people call it mountain magnolia. Okay, this one has 3 trunks, which is kind of odd to see. But it's still pretty large. This is a good sized one. See those 3 different trunks there. We kind of get back a little bit from it. But if you look up, I don't know how well you can see the leaves on it. Okay, it's a little bit difficult, and we'll maybe see one that's a little bit lower down, but it has these large sort of rounded leaves that are similar in shape to the Fraser magnolia, okay, which is also found here on the preserve. Okay, but the difference with cucumber tree and Fraser magnolia is cucumber tree doesn't have the earlobes that you see with the Fraser magnolia. If you look up the trunk there, you can see it's covered with all these knots and knobs and things like that, and this is where limbs at one time were found, branches, okay, that broke off over time as the tree grew. So these are all old branch scars that just healed over a period of time. But this is a knotty old thing, and this is not really very typical of what I'm used to seeing with mountain magnolia. But given that this one has 3 trunks, it's probably part of the reason why it looks that way. But if you look back up the trail there, where in the direction we just came, look at all those. Look at that row of big trees up through there. Okay, most of those are tulip poplar. There's a couple of big locusts in there. Okay, but the majority are poplars. And this has always been one of my favorite sections of this trail, is because it's just lined with these king-size old growth trees. It's such a cool place. One of my absolute favorite places in Hickory Nut Gorge, just because of the biodiversity that's found here. All right, we're getting into another area. Some really big trees. Okay, this is a buckeye tree, and notice it has a really unique looking bark compared to some of the others, and it's interesting, and we'll see some of these hopefully in a few minutes. We'll look at the fruit. You see the fruit actually even resemble the bark of buckeye. Okay, what I'm looking for though is a leaf. I'd like to show you a buckeye leaf because it's quite different than anything that we have seen thus far, but it is getting a little late in the season, and buckeye leaves are another one that just kind of, they don't really turn color, they just kind of turn brown and fall off because they're rather thin. But we'll see some more amazing buckeyes here in just a second, so we'll just keep meandering here because there's a couple other big trees up here that I want you to see, okay, because we've not seen particularly this one. So this one right here, this ginormous tree, this is a northern red oak, and they're very similar to scarlet oak, okay, but northern red oak gets much bigger. It's more of a montane species, so generally find it more so in the mountains than we would down the Piedmont. The Piedmont you see more like to see southern red oak and scarlet oak, and then back up behind it is a really nice hickory tree. Okay, and by the looks of things, it's probably either a mockernut hickory or pig nut hickory. I can't tell, and there's no way. I'm not seeing any nuts on the ground or anything close enough where I can get to it. But probably pig nut, if I were just to take a guess. But look at this. This is just really nice northern red oak, and both of these are old growth trees. Okay, and there's another big northern red a little further up in the woods up there. Okay, but this is just big tree central here. And again, it goes back to the fact that the terrain is so steep getting up here. You just wouldn't have been able to get a horse team in here to cut these trees out. And so they will remain here until they're ready to fall and once again become part of the earth. But I just love seeing these big trees in here. And here's a shorter northern red. Let me jump up here, and so here's the leaf, okay, of northern red. You can see its similarity to scarlet oak with those sharp teeth at the end of each lobe, okay, which is how we know that it's a red oak, because of the sharp teeth. It's pinnately veined, okay, and just as we saw with the scarlet oak, it actually has some hairs that are located in the connection point between the lateral vein and the midrib. Okay, so that's another way for us to be able to identify this as northern red oak. Okay, there's a couple of one. I think that might be an old hickory down there that's dying. Okay, but there's some more northern reds in here, not nearly as big as this one we got here, but clearly this one is very old. All right, so while we're talking about big trees, here's another old growth tree. Remember, we mentioned Fraser magnolia a second ago. This is a Fraser magnolia. Oh, excuse me, mountain magnolia or cucumber tree. We talked about that earlier. That's what this one is. So there's another cucumber tree, but this one is an old growth one. This one is giant. Okay, this very well may be the biggest cucumber tree in Hickory Nut Gorge. I don't know what the state record is, and I can certainly go and find that out, and I may actually pursue that, because this one is over 36 inches. A friend of mine and I measured this tree several years ago, and it may actually be approaching 40 inches in diameter. That's how big this thing is. I mean, it is just wonderful, and it's big and tall. There's no possible way that you could actually see the top to truly get a good measurement of how tall it is. But it's such a nice tree, and they produce really beautiful flowers, and they're a very important food source for migratory birds as they fly through our area heading south for the winter. So really very vital species to the southern Appalachian forests. Okay, I mentioned basswood a second ago. Let's see if I can get this thing to come into focus here. There we go. Okay, this is the fruit of a basswood. So it's kind of long and flat, and has the fruits actually connected to it. Okay, they call this a phyllodes. Okay, and it's got the fruit actually attached to this. So it's not a true leaf. This is not a leaf at all. It's actually just part of the fruit. Okay, but it's really interesting, and you only see this with basswood. It's something that's unique to the things here in the southern Appalachian forest where we live. Okay, but it's got the fruit attached to that. The whole thing will actually probably part of the fruit if we were really to get technical about it. But it's got those little berries that hang off the end. It'll have 2 little berries, but pretty interesting. Okay, this is a shrub called bladdernut. In bladdernut, this is actually kind of an unusual place to find bladdernut. It's not common to the mountains. This is more of a Piedmont species. So this is an example of something that's really kind of out of place. But you'll find this more down toward the eastern part of the Piedmont, down near Raleigh, kind of right between the boundary of the Piedmont and coastal plain. You find it in usually well-drained soil areas, and the soil here is very well drained. Okay, so it doesn't hold a lot of water. It gets plenty of water, okay, but it doesn't hold water for a long period of time because it's kind of a loamy soil, which is similar to what you have down in that particular area. So the soil, and down in the eastern part of the state, it grows more in floodplains. So it's a floodplain species. But here, it's actually up on a pretty steep slope. Okay, but so this is one of the things that makes the Bat Cave Preserve really unique. Okay, this is because it's just something that you don't see very many places. In fact, I've never seen bladdernut anywhere else in Hickory Nut Gorge. So this may be a claim to fame for the Bat Cave Preserve. But if you look, it's all down through here. This whole slope is just covered in bladdernut. Almost every shrub that you see down the slope there is bladdernut, and they're all loaded with these fruit. And they call it bladdernut because if you were to, like, if you look carefully, something crashed in the woods down there. If you look carefully there, those fruit are kind of they're filled with air, so it looks like there would actually be something in there. Okay, but it's not. It's just air, and this little seeds kind of shake around in there, so makes it rather interesting. Okay, bladdernut. This big old buckeye tree over here, yet another old growth tree. Now, this is called yellow buckeye. Buckeye, there's a couple different species found in North Carolina. Yellow buckeye is a mountain species, and then in the Piedmont and coastal plain you get a different one called horse chestnut, okay, which has reddish flowers. Okay, but these have a kind of a yellowish colored flower, but this one is huge. It's got this twin trunks up above that junction there, and this thing's going way on up there. Okay, but I wish I could find some good leaves, but we're kind of striking out there. But buckeye leaves are what we call palmately compound. Okay, so it has, its leaflets are arranged in a palmate pattern, okay, connected at one point on along their midrib. Okay, but has 5 leaflets. Okay, but again, if I happen to find one, I'll point it out. But these are just beautiful trees, and there's several right in here, and I'm going to look for some fruit here in a second and show those to you. Alright, so here's the fruit of a buckeye. Okay, it's got this weird looking hull that covers the nut. Okay, and there's usually 2 of them. It's either 2 or 4, I can't remember which. If I had to find one on the ground. Actually, there's a whole one right here. Let's look. So here's one. It's on the ground. This is the fruit of the buckeye. Okay, we opened it up. This one has 3. Okay, but these things are actually poisonous. Okay, we would not want to eat these. And the reason they found out they were poisonous is because they look a lot like a chestnut, and one of the reasons why people call them horse chestnuts. But they're poisonous, or at least supposedly they're half poisonous. So only one part is poisonous. But how in the heck would you know which half is and which half isn't? Okay, that's kind of beyond my knowledge there. Okay, so it looks like they have anywhere from 2 to 4. There's 2 in this one. So I guess it depends on the size of it. Okay, but if you look at the outside, okay, the outside of it looks very similar to the actual bark. Okay, but really interesting. Squirrels will eat them, and they'll carry them off. And it's said, the old timers used to say that if you carried a buckeye around in your pocket, then it would be good luck. Okay, but they call them buckeyes because I guess somebody said they resembled the eye of a deer, and maybe you had to use your imagination to that. But these things are huge by comparison to, say, a hickory nut or something like that. But pretty cool. Now's the time to find buckeyes, and usually on these mature trees they drop quite a few of them. So very neat thing to find out here. I'm gonna take this one with me. This is a different sort of fern here. This is called walking fern, and walking fern is one of my absolute favorites just because it's so neat. Walking fern, it has spores, and if we turn the leaf over here, we can actually see those spores. If I can get them to come into focus there, yep. So the sori are found there along the frond there. Now, the reason they call it walking fern is because not only can it reproduce by spores, okay, but it can also reproduce vegetatively. So this point here, it will take this frond and it will walk it. It will take, and where that touches into the ground, it will grow a new frond. So this is why they call it walking fern, because it can do that. And it's attached. Usually, you'll find it growing in these mossy patches on rocks and things like that. And that's where this one is located, on the rock. But this one is one that's very drought sensitive. And a few years ago, when we had a really bad drought here in the preserve, a lot of our populations of walking fern disappeared just because it just got so dry in here. But this is clearly very healthy, so it has recovered, which is a good thing. Recovery is always nice, and it shows how resilient many plant species are when they can recover from catastrophic things that occur in the forest. And drought is certainly a type of catastrophe that can result in death of lots of different things and can alter the dynamics within an ecosystem. So pretty cool. Got another fern worth mentioning here. This is called rockcap fern. And rockcap fern is called that because a lot of times you'll find it growing on little rocky places like this. There's a fern that's very similar to this. It actually has the same scientific name, called resurrection fern. And when resurrection fern, it will dry out, and then it will, if it gets wet, or well, actually when it dries out, it curls up and looks like it's dead. But when it gets wet again, it will open back up and be perfectly normal and healthy. Rockcap fern is very closely related to it. These are what they call an epiphyte. Okay, epiphytes generally live on other things, so these are capable of living on trees as well. Okay, and this is probably growing out of the moss that's layered here on the rock. If you look, you can see its spores there. They're kind of rounded. Okay, the sori, round sori. And if I can just get the thing to stay in focus, it's hard holding something and maintaining focus, but pretty neat. Rockcap fern. Here's another big, beautiful buckeye tree. Hey, there's tons of buckeyes here on the ground underneath it. All these are old growth. We're kind of sitting in underneath a rock outcropping in the midst of a ravine. There's this big steep ravine that goes down all the way to the river there. And there was probably at some point some kind of cataclysm that occurred here that resulted in lots of rocks being turned loose, because as you walk up that ravine, it's just chock full of big rocks. And we're not going to go up there today, perhaps another day when I'll take you up closer to where the caves are. There's just not a lot to see in the forest right now. We're kind of in a transition point where we've got some of the late summer flowers that are starting to transition into the fall flowers. So more goldenrods, more asters, and things like that will be what we would expect to see more of as time passes. But we just haven't quite reached that point yet. But we are at a little place. This is an interesting little rocky area. And this is a place called the Blowholes. Okay, and I'll show you why they call it that in a second, if we can, depending on how well the camera cooperates. But look at this big old rocky cliff here. This is a giant outcropping. There's a lot of things growing on it. Okay, so there's all kinds of ferns and mosses and neat things like that, because it's a really damp spot. Water runs down over the rock face, so it's a really cool place for a lot of neat things to grow and hang out. Okay, now what I want you to notice here, notice that plant is blowing. Okay, It's not me shaking the camera, although I have been guilty of that before. Okay, but this is air that's coming out of this giant crack here. Okay, this is a crack in the rock. Really cool air coming out of there. Air temperature is probably about 50 some degrees, maybe about 55, 56 degrees compared to the outside temperature, which is in the 70s. So it's actually a nice day outside. But this temperature differential is actually what causes this to blow. Okay, so this is based on the fact that you have cold air and warm air, and you have this exchange. So it's similar to what you would see if you opened the door to your house and you had your air conditioning going. It was hot outside, and what would happen would be that cool air from your air conditioning inside your house would come pouring out, okay, to where the hotter air is outside. Okay, and basically it's because inside there's a tighter space. Okay, so this air tends to be under pressure, and as long as the air outside is a different pressure than the air inside, okay, then the cooler air is going to move. If that pressure is the same, then you don't get any blowing occurring. Okay, but when there's a pressure differential between the two air spaces, okay, the one that has the higher pressure is going to push out into the area with the lower pressure. And so that's what is happening here. A lot of this is this air, this cooler air, because the sun never reaches inside there. Okay, so the air that is trapped in there tends to stay cool all the time, and of course wintertime actually will even further make that air cooler. So this air settles into the airspace inside there, and it literally falls out of the hole. Okay, so this is kind of coming out here. It's basically higher pressure in there, moving into the area of low pressure. So pretty cool. There's also some really neat plants out here. This little plant species that you see here, this is called grotto alum root, and it's one of the rare species of Hickory Nut Gorge. One of the things that makes Bat Cave special. But not just Bat Cave, other places here in the gorge where you'll find this plant. But it's amazing because this plant, if you look, it's not growing on anything of any major substance. It's basically growing on the moss that you find here on the rock face. And there are places where, like right up here, where it's got even less to grow on. And this is just an example of persistence and resilience. The only moisture that it's getting is what moisture runs down off the rock and covers it. It gets its nutrients directly from the rock that it's growing on. And in some places that I have found this, I've found it growing on nothing but rock. There wouldn't be any moss around. So this one's actually fortunate because it can feed on the soil that the moss creates that's on this rock, although that's not very much. It gets very little sunlight because of where it's growing, so it's kind of in a protected place. So it's very low light, low soil, low water in general. So that's why it fills the bill as a persistent plant, because most plants would not be able to tolerate those conditions. So pretty neat. Alright, here's an interesting dogwood. This is called alternate leaf dogwood. If you look up close there, you can see that the leaves are alternately spaced compared to flowering dogwood, which has opposite leaves. Okay, this has a green stem, and it doesn't get nearly as tall as the flowering dogwood does. And this is another species that tends to be more found in the mountains as opposed to the Piedmont. So, but alternate leaf dogwood, and it's because of that alternate leaf arrangement that you see with this species. Alright, so we've gotten to visit the blowholes, okay, the prominent feature at the Bat Cave Preserve. But our goal here today was to focus on primarily these old growth trees that we see here, and hopefully we'll be back here at Bat Cave Preserve very soon, where I can show you some more things and maybe even get a a little closer look at the caves themselves. We'll just have to play it by ear. So stay tuned for the next video.